In the summer of 2001, in the beautiful mountains of Kentucky, I was a park ranger with the Forest Service at the time. It had been a typically uneventful day until I decided to take my lunch break off-site in an area known for its lush wildlife activity. After all, that's why I'd chosen this job, so that I could be out in nature more often and observe its beauty firsthand. I drove down an old logging road until I came upon a particularly beautiful meadow surrounded by tall trees and very lush greenery. I can remember it. The sun shone brightly overhead, making everything sparkle as if almost magical. I parked the truck, got out, putting my food onto a large rock, and settling down to enjoy the view. That's when something strange occurred. Something incredibly weird and strange appeared from out of the woods, but far off in the distance. Whatever it was incredibly tall, at least 6 or 7 feet in length, if I had to guess. Shaggy fur that seemed very unkempt and dry despite the humidity. Its color varied between dark browns and grays, and its ears were pointed upright like a wolf's, but they stood up, kind of like an antelope's on high alert. The most disturbing thing that stuck out to me were the eyes. They were as black as coal, and at the same time felt incredibly piercing, like it could see right through me. Its smell wafted along with it, an incredibly putrid smell that was reminiscent of blood and wet dog. It was menacing, to say the least. Now, I could hardly believe my eyes as it slowly made its way towards me, its movements very calculated and incredibly fluid, despite being on all fours. I scrambled for my gun, realizing that it was still in the truck. A massive mistake. The being or animal seemed to sense this, for it began picking up its pace and now moving from a jog, or at least what I would call a jog, to a run with incredible, fast, inhuman speed. My heart raced as adrenaline kicked in, and I began running away as fast as possible, knowing I had no other choice if I wanted to escape alive. As I ran, I noticed that it had changed trajectory slightly and was now headed straight for the truck. Now panic took over. I knew this thing was going to outrun me. I did not have time to fire my weapon or do anything else. All I could do was watch as it leapt onto the hood of the truck and began clawing at the windshield with its arms and hands. My fear and adrenaline mixed together in a potent cocktail as I watched this thing pounce on my vehicle while trying to break into it. After what felt like an eternity, a noise startled this thing and it disappeared, vanishing, which I did not even see where it went, leaving me alone, petrified and scared to talk about this experience for years to come. I could still recall that moment very vividly in my mind, the fear, the adrenaline, my near miss with this thing that seemed to have no regard for my life. It screamed in anger, like a wounded animal, as it disappeared. It seemed upset that I had managed to get away from it. I still feel a chill whenever I think about the pain and terror this thing caused me that day. Even though it was almost 20 years ago now, it's an experience that will stay with me forever. So if you ever find yourself out in the woods and come across something strange, don't take any chances. Just run. Your life could very well depend on it. I am now a retired police sergeant, but worked for the force for the better half of 23 years. The story I'm about to tell you takes place back in 2005 to 2006 in rural Illinois. It was a small community filled with cornfields and other farming opportunities. We had one main street that bordered the town's border with city limits, which was Greenfield Avenue. I was living there with my wife and daughter, who was 9 at this time. We lived down the street from Benton's Market. I can't remember the street name, of course, because it has been so long, but We lived before a bend that led down to the headquarters of a company that had been in business for decades. This area was filled with wooded areas, and I remember that one day, my wife and I were taking a walk near the railroad tracks to try and get some peace from the hustle and bustle of life. Little did we know, this trip would spark an event that would traumatize us for years to come. As we continued to explore the unknown paths of this countryside town, our daughter saw something strange lurking in the shadows of a nearby tree line. We thought it was just her imagination at first, but as we began to investigate, we noticed that there truly was something out there, staring right at us. It could have been another animal, maybe a coyote or wolf. However, there was something about the shape of this creature that made it look strangely humanoid. As we got closer to figure out what it was, our daughter screamed in horror as we realized what it was. A canine. It had dark fur with patches of gray. Its head seemed larger than normal, and in fact, it reminded me very much of a jackal, or at least the way the head looked. Its eyes were bright yellow and menacingly narrow. It stood there motionless, watching us intently from the shadows of the tree line. We all felt a chill go down our spines at the sight of it. My wife looked at me fearfully and told me to do something. So I took a step forward while waving my arms in an effort to scare off whatever it was. This thing did not move at first, and only stared back with an equally eerie intensity that I could still very vividly remember. Eventually, its curiosity seemed to peak as it kind of smirked, turned the other way, and almost stumbled slowly away, as if it had been hurt by someone or something. The entire time it was stumbling away, it kept turning its head back toward us, as if to make sure we were not going to follow it. We all watched in silence as this bizarre canine just disappeared. My wife was very, very shaken, and I myself remember being stunned. This was back before my parents had passed, and during this time, I would call my mother very often and tell her how my day was and what was going on in my life. Well, I had told her about my experience. She actually told my father, and both of them, well, I should say, all three of us ended up staying up till about 3 a.m, swapping stories. But in particular, my mother was adamant that this was not the only sighting of that particular strange animal. Apparently, she had known about many others in and around the area. We never figured out what it was that we saw, but since then, I've been more cautious when walking through wooded areas. I still live in the Clearfield area, and figured I would share this experience with you. I was a 911 dispatcher for about 6 years from 2010 to 2016. While I got a lot of what you can consider disturbing calls, there's always one that sticks out to me. Long story short, there was a woman who was nearly mauled by what she described as a large bipedal canine that had tried to break into her home in the middle of the night. She said that it stood about 7 feet tall, covered in thick fur, growling at her through the window. At first, I thought this call might have been an elaborate prank or something, but when I heard the sheer terror in her voice, I knew it wasn't. There was an honesty in her fear, a genuine sense of terror, and I could feel that through the phone line. She described it like something straight out of a horror movie. I didn't know how to respond other than telling her I would send somebody out. The officer had gone out there with another officer, driving up the slow, long gravel driveway towards her home, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of danger or unusual activity. But all they saw were trees swaying in the night breeze. When they arrived at her house, she was standing outside on her porch, waiting with a very alarmed, terrified expression. We're all surprised she was even able to safely go outside. She was very visibly shaken, wringing her hands as she told them what had happened. She informed my colleagues that the creature had managed to break her window, but before it could reach her, It decided to disappear because it saw the headlights of the police vehicle coming up the driveway, just in time. It appears when observing the front broken window that something had broke it from the outside in, and considering the caller was a tiny, petite old woman, I seriously doubt that she had the strength to break the window. Then, once my colleagues began speaking to a few of her neighbors, apparently there had been reported similar sightings in the area, and recently. One of them even claimed to have seen something very similar while deer hunting a few miles away. We decided to check out the other houses just to make sure that nothing was amiss. When one of my colleagues arrived at these homes, they were shocked by what they thought they saw. An enormous animal footprint implanted into the mud near the backyard fence line. It was clear that some kind of massive canine had been there. A search was done of the surrounding woods for any sign of this mysterious creature, and after a while, we had given up. A couple of other officers who I was very close friends with had got called out to that neighborhood several other times since then. The one, whom I'm purposely not naming, always recalled it being eerie and scarily quiet. One of my colleagues who had gone out there to respond to a call apparently saw this thing, and it was so traumatic for them that it made them question their entire law enforcement career. Now, we couldn't really get answers out of the guy, but apparently he spoke to his psychologist about it, and they told him that he was just having an hallucination from a childhood trauma that had manifested into what he saw, but I think we all know that there's something more going on than we'd all like to admit. But that's my take on it. You make of it what you will. I'm 37 years old now, so this story goes back to the 80s and 90s while growing up, and all the horrific things I saw and experiences while on the reservation. My grandmother, mother, and cousins were deeply into witchcraft. I would hear stories of skinwalkers and dogmen lurking around the area, but little did I know what was about to come my way. Now, keep in mind, we also didn't use the term skinwalkers and dogmen. I'm just simplifying that for you so you can understand. It started with a pretty normally quiet night. Mostly everybody had gone to bed early due to a long day at work or just the general monotony of everyday life. I remember that night like it was yesterday. I had just started heading back towards my room when I heard a noise coming from the front porch outside. At first, I thought it was possibly an animal scampering about or one of our neighbor's dogs out for some late-night fun. But I noticed something different near the bushes outside the front of our home, with fur that appeared to be almost pitch black in color. My heart began pounding in my chest as I crept closer and closer to try and get a better view of what this thing was. I could make out a face that seemed almost canine-like. Sharp teeth, disgustingly yellow eyes. For a brief moment, it looked right at me, and I felt my knees wobble as I stumbled back in shock. My mother heard the commotion outside and came in to investigate, along with my uncle, who had a few felonies on his record, but always seemed to know more about the dark side of life than anyone else. We both stood there in utter disgust at what we were seeing before our very eyes. What appeared to be some kind of hybrid animal, a creature made up of parts from various species of wildlife, or so I thought. I remember my uncle muttering something under his breath about skinwalkers and shape-shifting witches while my mother was in complete shock and disbelief. I had heard stories before about shapeshifters, but this was different, because usually, at least from when I grew up around, they would shapeshift into benign animals. But again, keep in mind, I had never been in a situation where I had seen this practice go on in a malevolent way. My uncle then instructed us to go back inside the house, to lock all the doors and windows, as this creature was not something we should mess with. We did all just that, and waited for what felt like hours, until we finally heard commotion outside, followed by silence, assuming it had just disappeared. As I look back now, I realize that this must have been one of those demonic spirits, or, again, a skinwalker, as you call it. It still makes me shiver to think about. My uncle prayed over our house so long and hard that night. My grandmother was a powerful witch, and she died the following year in her sleep. I'm sure something happened the night we encountered the creature, something none of us could ever explain or possibly understand. It's like it was in the house, like a dark cloud hovering over us, all until it eventually dissipated into nothingness. It's been years since then, and I still remember it as if it were yesterday. So every time I hear stories or read upon stories about these things, my mind often wanders back to that night, just trying to make sense of what really happened. I can only hope that no other family has to go through such a horror. But I learned then that sometimes the things we fear most can also be the greatest teachers. Now I understand why my grandmother always believed in the power of darkness and spoke so highly of it. Why it was important for us all to pray over the house that night. It may seem strange, but I believe it's what she did in order to protect us from the evil forces beyond our mortal understanding.